I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The day everything unraveled started out like any other. I had no clue that a simple stop at the diner could twist my life into knots I'd never imagined. I'd been managing my car dealership, juggling appointments and paperwork, and wanted nothing more than a quiet dinner alone. My mind had been cluttered with sales targets, employee disputes, and paperwork, so I decided to unwind with a burger and some peace. The diner was warm and smelled of coffee and grease. I took my usual booth in the corner, figuring I could eat, people watch, and recharge a little. As I settled in, I half listened to the hum of conversations around me. The waitress dropped off my coffee, and I let my mind wander, trying to mentally escape the stress of my business for just a moment. Then I heard a voice. Familiar, unmistakable. I couldn't ignore it. It was George, my best friend since high school. We'd been through thick and thin together, he was practically family. But the way he was talking now, casually, almost laughing, something in my gut tightened. I tuned in, keeping my head low, not daring to turn my head just yet. What I heard next was a punch to the gut. George was talking about Jenna, my wife. He didn't say her name, but the way he described her, I knew. He went on, discussing details no one else should know, details about the very woman I'd shared my life with for over a decade. George's voice was low but sharp, each word cutting me as he joked with the guy he was talking to, clearly unaware of my presence only a few feet away. He laughed about how clueless I was, not realizing I was listening to every sordid detail. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, gritting my teeth so hard I thought they might shatter. Part of me wanted to storm over and confront him right then, to let loose every ounce of anger boiling inside. But the rational part of me, the part that had been trained by years of dealing with difficult customers and shady business deals, held me back. I knew that an outburst here would only make things worse. The waitress brought over my burger, snapping me back to the present. I nodded, managing a tight smile, though I felt like a volcano on the verge of eruption. I forced myself to stay seated, pretending to be engrossed in my meal as I tried to process what I just overheard. As I sat there, I started piecing together things I'd previously dismissed. Jenna's distant behavior, her sudden late nights at work, her reluctance to share details about her day, all the small things I'd chalked up to stress or routine. Looking back, I realized I'd seen the signs. I just hadn't wanted to believe them. I left the diner without finishing my meal, practically sprinting to my car. I sat there in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I took deep breaths, fighting the wave of anger and betrayal crashing over me. What was I supposed to do now? How could I possibly move forward with this knowledge? As I drove home that night, I resolved to get proof. Confronting Jenna without solid evidence would only give her room to twist the story or deny it altogether. I knew how these things went. I'd seen it enough in other people's lives to know that a baseless confrontation often just leads to more lies and deception. I couldn't afford to let her wriggle out of this. The next day, I started looking up private investigators, trying to find someone discreet and professional. After a few phone calls, I connected with a guy named Frank, who came highly recommended. When I explained the situation, he was calm, almost detached. "I've seen worse," he assured me. That didn't make me feel any better, but I appreciated his professionalism. He laid out his approach, discreet tracking, monitoring her movements, gathering concrete proof. It would take time and patience, but he was confident he'd be able to get the evidence I needed. Over the following weeks, Frank kept me updated with text messages, vague but enough to let me know he was on top of it. He set up a tracker on Jenna's phone, allowing him to monitor her location without her ever knowing. I felt a pang of guilt for invading her privacy, but the anger buried that quickly. I had every right to know what she was doing, especially if she was betraying me. During those weeks, I kept up appearances. I didn't let on that anything was wrong. I went about my daily routine, forcing myself to smile when Jenna was around, pretending everything was fine. She seemed none the wiser, though sometimes I caught her watching me with an odd look, as if she sensed something off. I shrugged it off, playing the role of the oblivious husband to perfection. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Frank called. He'd gathered enough evidence, he said. Photos, text messages, location logs, all of it damning, all of it undeniable. He'd compiled everything into a neat, brutal package of truth. "You've got what you need," he said simply. I sat alone in my office after that call, looking at the file he'd sent over. Each image, each message, was a dagger to my heart, confirming what I already knew but had hoped against hope was wrong. Jenna's infidelity wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was a full-blown affair, one she'd meticulously hidden from me for months. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, my mind replaying every memory, every conversation we'd had in the last year. Each time she'd lied to my face, each time she'd smiled and said she loved me, all the while betraying everything we'd built together. I spent the next few days in a strange haze. The weight of betrayal sat heavy on my chest, making it hard to breathe, but I pushed through it. If Jenna noticed my quiet mood, she didn't mention it. It was as if the woman I'd known for 14 years was a stranger who could look me in the eyes and smile while hiding a world of deception. But I wasn't going to confront her outright. No, she'd lost the right to a simple argument. I was going to dismantle this affair, and whatever plans she had with George, piece by piece. There would be no outburst, no screaming match, there would only be the cold, calculated end to everything she thought she could get away with. First, I focused on preparing myself financially. I contacted a lawyer to discuss my options, making it clear that I was looking for an amicable way to separate. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, listened quietly as I laid out the basics of my situation. When I mentioned the affair, she gave a small nod. "We'll take it step by step," she said. "Gather evidence, which you already have, and plan for the division of assets. But I recommend waiting to serve her until we've mapped out everything." Her calm professionalism was exactly what I needed. She handed me a checklist of documents to collect, reminding me to stay discreet. "Patience is your ally here," she said firmly. "If you tip her off, she might try to take steps to protect herself financially." The next few days, I dedicated every spare moment to getting things in order. I gathered bank statements, property documents, and financial records, all the things we'd once shared and which would soon be divided. It felt strange, cataloging the life we'd built together as if it were an inventory list. I remembered buying our home, Jenna's excitement when we'd put down roots, her enthusiasm about the future. Looking at the numbers and papers before me, it all felt hollow now. Once I had my financials in order, I turned my attention to the revenge I was carefully building. I was going to make sure Jenna and George's betrayal didn't go unnoticed, but I had to be careful, to make every move count. Public humiliation wasn't my style, but letting her get away without consequences wasn't an option either. My chance came faster than I expected. A few days later, Jenna mentioned that she'd be meeting some friends after work. She was casual about it, slipping it into conversation as she packed her things for the day. Her tone was too light, and the way she avoided looking at me felt like confirmation. She wasn't meeting her friends, she was meeting him. She had no idea that I knew the truth. "Have a good time," I said, smiling. I even handed her the keys to the car, forcing myself to act calm. Watching her drive away, I felt a pang of anger that I immediately buried. Tonight, she was going to think she'd gotten away with it. I waited a few hours, then made a call to George's wife, Lisa. We'd never been close friends, more like acquaintances who exchanged polite hellos at gatherings, but tonight, we were about to form an unspoken alliance. Lisa answered on the third ring, sounding distracted. "Hello. Lisa, it's Kurt," I said, my voice even. I could almost hear her tension increase through the phone. "I need to talk to you. It's about George, and my wife, Jenna." There was a pause. I knew she could sense something was wrong, but she stayed calm. Go ahead. They've been seeing each other, I said bluntly, sparing her the softer approach. I've got proof, if you need it. She took a shaky breath, but her voice was steady. I had a feeling. I just didn't want to believe it. She exhaled, and I heard something snap in her voice. Do you have a plan? I told her my idea. George had a reputation for throwing small gatherings, informal events where he'd invite friends, family, and even clients to show off his latest achievements. I suggested we use the next one to reveal their affair, exposing everything right in front of the people they'd lied to. Lisa agreed without hesitation, adding a few ideas of her own. She was just as angry as I was, and I could tell she was eager to end this in a way that would leave a mark. We set the plan in motion. Over the next few days, we coordinated our schedules, exchanging information on George and Jenna's routines. Lisa confided that George had been distant for months, staying out late and making excuses, similar to Jenna's behavior. It was painful to hear her talk about her own suspicions, but it strengthened my resolve. We weren't just dealing with betrayal, we were dealing with people who'd taken advantage of our trust and friendship. The night of the gathering came quickly. I arrived early, pretending I was just there to help George set up, as I'd done a few times before. I kept my tone friendly, even joked with him, and forced myself not to react as he grinned, entirely unaware of what was coming. I watched him interact with guests, laughing and enjoying himself, with no idea that his carefully hidden affair was about to be exposed. Lisa arrived shortly after, blending in with the other guests. We exchanged a brief nod, and I could see the resolve in her eyes. Tonight, she was as much a part of this as I was, ready to make sure George and Jenna faced the consequences of their actions. When Jenna finally arrived, her smile faltered slightly when she saw me. But she quickly covered it up, moving through the room, greeting everyone as if nothing were amiss. She hadn't expected me to be here, but her surprise was short-lived. In her mind, she'd still gotten away with everything. I let her think that. Finally, once everyone had settled and George was basking in the attention of his friends and colleagues, Lisa and I exchanged a glance. It was time. I walked up to George and tapped him on the shoulder. Hey, George, I said, my voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, why don't you tell everyone about the time you spent with my wife? The room went silent. All eyes were on us, and George's expression froze, shifting from confusion to panic in seconds. He stammered, trying to laugh it off, but the guests were no longer smiling. Beside him, Jenna's face went pale, her forced smile vanishing as the weight of what was happening sank in. Lisa stepped forward, her voice icy as she addressed the crowd. My husband here has been seeing Jenna behind Kurt's back, she announced, her tone unwavering. They've been lying to all of us for months. The room erupted in whispers and shocked gasps. I felt a strange satisfaction watching George and Jenna's faces crumple under the weight of their exposed deceit. They had no more excuses, no more lies to hide behind. Their web of secrecy was torn open for everyone to see. After the initial shock wore off, I turned to Jenna, my voice low but firm. We're done, I said, the finality of my words settling over her like a storm cloud. She looked at me, desperate, as if trying to piece together an excuse, but I shook my head. I wasn't interested in anything she had to say. I turned on my heel and left, ignoring her calls behind me. I drove away from that scene without looking back, feeling a mix of relief and an odd hollowness. I should have felt triumphant after watching Jenna and George exposed in front of their friends, colleagues, and everyone who had once trusted them. But there was a pit in my stomach that refused to settle. I'd just thrown my life as I knew it into upheaval, and although I felt justified, I knew that tonight would be just the beginning. Once I got home, the silence wrapped around me like a thick fog. I looked around our house, the photos on the wall, the souvenirs from trips, little reminders of a life I'd thought was solid. I picked up a photo of us from our anniversary trip to the coast, staring at Jenna's smile. She'd looked genuinely happy, her arm around me, her gaze soft and loving. It was hard to reconcile that woman with the person I'd just left in George's living room, humiliated, frantic, and panicking as her world crumbled around her. I set the photo down and sat in the living room, wondering if Jenna would come home or try to stay somewhere else. Part of me wanted her to walk through that door, to confront me, to explain herself even though I knew there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage she'd done. Another part of me hoped she wouldn't show up, that she'd disappear from my life just as easily as she'd hidden her affair. An hour passed, and I heard her car pull up. My heart raced as I heard her footsteps approach the door, and then the soft sound of it opening. She stepped in, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked defeated, stripped of the self-assured woman she'd once been. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the weight of the night pressing down between us. "Kurt," she began, her voice shaky, I don't even know where to start." I crossed my arms, leaning back on the couch, maintaining a calm exterior. "Start with the truth," I said. "Why did you do it, Jenna? Why throw away everything we built?" Her gaze dropped to the floor, and she took a deep breath. I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she said, almost whispering. "At first, it was just attention. Something different. But then it turned into something else, and I got caught up in it. I never wanted to hurt you." "That's the thing, Jenna," I replied, my tone cold. "You did hurt me. You hurt me every time you lied, every time you looked me in the eye and pretended like nothing was wrong. And you did it with my best friend." My voice cracked, and I felt the sharp edge of betrayal cut deeper as I said it out loud. She winced, taking a step closer. I know, Kurt. I was selfish. I can't take it back, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. But I love you. I swear I do. I just lost myself." "Love?" I scoffed, shaking my head. "That's not love, Jenna. Love isn't something you betray. Love isn't something you trade for a few stolen moments with someone else. Love is staying loyal even when things get hard, even when you're tempted. What you did isn't love." Tears streamed down her face, and she wiped them away, her shoulders slumping. "You're right," she whispered, barely able to look at me. "But please, Kurt, is there any way we can try to work this out? I don't want to lose you. I know I don't deserve it, but if you'll give me a chance, I'll do anything." Her plea hung in the air, and I felt a wave of anger surge through me. She'd had her chance. She'd had years of my love, loyalty, and trust, and she'd taken it all for granted. But beneath that anger was a small, quiet ache, a part of me that remembered the woman I'd fallen in love with, the woman I'd once built a life with. I took a steadying breath. "Jenna," I said, my voice controlled, "you already made your choice. I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again, let alone trust you. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed us. And I don't think there's any coming back from that." She nodded, her face crumbling as she took in the finality of my words. She sank onto the edge of the couch, her head in her hands. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. I thought maybe if I apologized, if I showed you that I was willing to change." "It's too late for that," I said firmly, standing up. "I don't want your apology. I want my dignity back. I want the years you took for granted. But I can't get those things back, can I?" I walked toward the door, needing to put distance between us, to breathe air that wasn't stifled by her betrayal. She looked up, her eyes pleading. "Where are you going?" "Out," I replied curtly. "I need time to think. I can't be here right now." I left without another word, ignoring the sobs that followed me out the door. The cold night air hit me like a shock, but it was grounding. I felt a mixture of freedom and a strange, bitter sadness as I walked down the street, away from the house that had once felt like a sanctuary. I didn't know where I was going. I wandered for hours, replaying everything over and over. I'd spent so long loving Jenna, trusting her implicitly, that it felt surreal to face a reality without her. But I also knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. Too much had happened, too much trust had been broken. Eventually, I found myself on a bench overlooking the city. The lights glowed in the distance, and I sat there, letting the silence settle around me. It was strange, sitting alone, contemplating the life I'd thought was so solid. I wondered how I'd let it get to this point, how I'd been so blind. But betrayal has a way of slipping in unnoticed, like a shadow that only reveals itself when the light hits it just right. In the quiet, a sense of clarity washed over me. Jenna had made her choices, and I had to make mine. I realized that holding on to the pain, the anger, would only give her betrayal more power over me. I had to let go, to focus on rebuilding, even if it meant starting over from scratch. That realization didn't dull the ache in my chest, but it made it bearable. By the time I made it back home, it was nearly dawn. I half expected Jenna to be gone, but when I walked in, she was still there, sitting on the couch, as if she hadn't moved all night. She looked up at me, her face pale and exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red. "Are you going to file for divorce?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," I replied, no longer hesitant. "I am. It's over, Jenna. I can't live like this, not with what you've done. We'll go through the process, and after that, we'll both go our separate ways." She didn't argue. She just nodded, her expression resigned. "I understand," she said softly, looking down at her hands. "I guess I should pack a bag." I didn't respond as she stood, moving quietly toward the bedroom. A part of me felt relief, but another part felt a deep sadness, a mourning for the life we'd shared, for the future we'd never have. In the end, I watched her go, feeling both broken and oddly whole, knowing that while I might never truly heal from this, I'd at least regained control of my life. And that, I realized, was the only thing worth holding on to now. Months passed, and the initial sting of betrayal dulled into a familiar ache, one that I'd grown accustomed to carrying. Life had settled into a new rhythm, though the house was emptier without Jenna's presence. I finalized the divorce paperwork, each signature on each page like a little release, a step further from the mess she'd left behind. She'd moved in with her sister in another part of town, and aside from the occasional logistics about splitting assets, we had barely spoken. I'd moved on, or at least, I thought I had. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I noticed a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Seconds later, my phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Lisa, George's now ex-wife. I hadn't heard from her since the day we exposed Jenna and George's affair, both of us too caught up in our own lives to maintain much contact afterward. I assumed we were better off leaving it at that. The text was short, but it caught me off guard. "Kurt, it's important. Can we meet?" A part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave that part of my life behind, but something about her message struck a nerve. I agreed to meet her at a quiet cafe downtown, not sure what to expect but feeling a strange heaviness in my chest. Lisa was already seated when I arrived, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She looked up as I approached, and her face wore a strained expression. She forced a smile, but I could see worry behind her eyes. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice quiet. "Sure," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "What's going on?" She hesitated, glancing down at her cup before looking back up at me. "It's about Jenna," she said. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt my stomach clench involuntarily. Jenna had been out of my mind for so long, yet here was Lisa, dragging her back to the forefront. "What about her?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. Lisa took a deep breath. "She's not doing well, Kurt. I ran into her sister recently, and she told me that Jenna's been struggling. She's in a rough spot. I frowned, trying to mask the mix of emotions swirling inside me. Lisa, I don't know if you remember, but Jenna did this to herself. I tried to help her, I tried to make things work, and she threw it all away. I know, she said, her voice gentle. I know what she did, Kurt. I know she doesn't deserve your sympathy. But, she's losing everything. She's barely working, and her sister told me she's been in and out of the hospital. Apparently, she's been drinking heavily, and, I don't think she's doing well mentally, either. I sat back, trying to absorb what Lisa was saying. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, wanted to believe that Jenna's suffering was the inevitable result of her own actions. But another part of me, one I'd tried to bury, felt an ache, a longing to help her even after everything. I hated that feeling, hated that she still had any hold on me. But I couldn't shake it. Kurt, Lisa continued, her voice wavering, she doesn't know I'm telling you this. She wouldn't want you to see her like this. But I thought you should know. She's alone, Kurt. She's pushed everyone away, including her sister, and she's falling apart. I forced a swallow, feeling the bitter taste of pity rise in my throat. Why are you telling me this, Lisa? What do you want me to do about it? Lisa looked at me with a sad smile. I don't know. I guess I thought maybe, if she knew you still cared, even a little, it might give her a reason to pull herself together. I know it's asking a lot, but sometimes people just need to know someone's still there. I nodded slowly, unsure what to say. A part of me felt weak for even considering it, but the memories of our life together still lingered, haunting me in quiet moments when I thought I'd moved on. Later that night, after hours of wrestling with myself, I decided to call her. It was an impulse, one I wasn't sure I'd go through with until I dialed the number and heard her voice on the other end. She sounded startled, her voice rough and strained, as though she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Jenna, I began, it's Kurt. I heard you weren't doing well. I just wanted to check in. There was a pause, and when she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. Kurt, I didn't expect to hear from you. I don't know what to say. I heard her choke back a sob, and I felt my heart tighten. Jenna, I said softly, I know we're done. I know things can't go back to the way they were. But, you don't have to go through this alone. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. There was silence on the other end, and I could hear her struggling to hold herself together. Thank you, she whispered, her voice breaking. You have no idea how much that means. We spoke for a few minutes, mostly about nothing, filling the empty spaces between us with small, kind words. When we hung up, I felt lighter, but also more vulnerable. I told myself it was just a one-time gesture, a small kindness for the person she used to be, the woman I once loved. But one call turned into another, and then another. Over the next few weeks, we spoke more often. Jenna was fragile, lost, and I could tell she was clinging to each conversation as though it were a lifeline. I tried to keep things platonic, but old memories began seeping back into my heart, softening the anger I'd held onto for so long. One night, she asked to see me, her voice hesitant and filled with hope. Against my better judgment, I agreed, feeling that old, familiar pull despite everything. We met at a quiet park, and she looked thinner, her face drawn and tired. But there was a light in her eyes, a spark that hadn't been there before. We talked for hours, sharing memories and laughing about moments we hadn't thought of in years. For a brief moment, it felt like the past was within reach, that we could rebuild what we'd lost. As the night wore on, she reached for my hand, and I didn't pull away. In that moment, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way to heal. Maybe we could find a new beginning, something stronger than the broken pieces of our past. But just as I began to let my guard down, to open my heart to the possibility of forgiveness, I felt her hand slip from mine. I looked over, confused, and saw her slumped against the bench, her face pale. Panic surged through me, and I shook her, calling her name, but there was no response. Her breaths were shallow, her skin cold. I dialed 911 with trembling hands, trying to keep her awake, to keep her talking. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but it felt like an eternity. They worked on her, their faces grim, and I stood there helpless, watching as they lifted her onto a stretcher and into the ambulance. I followed, my mind reeling, my heart breaking all over again. At the hospital, I waited in a sterile, empty room, the fluorescent lights harsh and unfeeling. A doctor eventually came in, his face somber, and I knew before he said a word. Jenna was gone. A mixture of alcohol and a lethal dose of painkillers had taken her in the dead of night, just as we were finding a way back to each other. I sat there, numb, the weight of her loss pressing down on me. She'd been right there, inches away, and I'd failed to see how deeply she'd been hurting. All the anger, all the betrayal felt meaningless in the face of the finality of her absence. I'd spent months hardening my heart against her, only to find it shattered beyond repair. As I left the hospital in the early hours of the morning, the world felt colder, emptier. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd hated, was gone, and there was no one to blame but myself. I'd held on to my anger so tightly, thinking it was strength, but in the end, it had only blinded me to the person she truly was, a person lost and struggling, who had needed me more than I'd ever realized. In the end, there was no revenge, no justice. Just the quiet echo of a life cut short, a love that could never be mended, and the hollow ache of a heart that had once held so much promise.